Well, thank you very much, Robin. We're very excited to be presenting today. I'm going to start with the title slide. So this presentation is about the Asian longhorn beetle infestation in Worcester, Massachusetts, the devastation that the beetle incurred, and also the replanting efforts that ensued. To date, this is the largest infestation of the Asian longhorn beetle in North American history. And Worcester Tree Initiative is celebrating its 10-year anniversary this year. The location of Worcester is critical in this story because of where Worcester sits in relation to the maple producing forests in New Hampshire and Vermont, and also for the fact that our city sits on the edge of the contiguous forest that runs all the way up to the Arctic Circle. So it's very critical for people to get in here and contain this infestation. Oh, next slide.
It's not advancing.
Oh.
All right, so first, as an introduction to Worcester Tree Initiative, our mission is generally to care for and improve the urban tree canopy in Worcester County. Initially, we were focused only on the Asian longhorn beetle quarantine zone, and we'll show you what that looks like a little bit later. But as we've grown and become a program of Tower Hill Botanic Garden, our parameters have increased. So this first slide about our goals, I want to share with you the three goals that we have. First would be community engagement. We want to get community members involved with trees in their area. So in the neighborhoods where they live, in the cities where they live, we want people to be taking care of their forests. Number two is, of course, to sustain the urban and community forest. We're developing programming around the urban forest, planting projects, pruning programs, trainings, tree health assessments and mapping activities, and all focusing on the good policy and good public information so that the community can be better engaged. And then the third is to promote environmental justice. So we work to understand where trees are and where they are lacking in our city. And then we also work to create viable planting projects in these areas.
So let's get back to the beginning. Tower Hill, Worcester Tree Initiative began under the guidance of Congressman Jim McGovern and Lieutenant Governor of the time, Tim Murray. And both of these men still sit on our steering committee today. In doing their campaign work, they both understood how important trees were to the community where they lived and where they worked. And they recognized the importance of having a replanting program when they understood that 30,000 trees were going to be cut down predominantly in one neighborhood in Worcester. So the Burncoat neighborhood suffered the most losses of this infestation. Out of the initial 30,000 trees that were cut down, approximately 24,000 of those occurred in this one particular neighborhood, which translated to about 90% of their tree canopy. So by the happy news is that by October 2014, between the three replanting partners, of which we were one of them, which were the City of Worcester, Worcester Tree Initiative, and the state agency, the Department of Conservation and Recreation, we were able to replace those 30,000 trees. So it was a really great vision on the part of these two men to set us up and get that going.
So the eradication part of Asian longhorn beetle, because this is a pest that we feel we can eradicate, and it's not so fast moving and so hard to detect that it is going to spread inevitably. So the eradication program began in 2008, once the discovery of Asian longhorn beetle was confirmed. And Ruth will tell you a little bit about the story of how that was discovered. But the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, they are now responsible for checking trees and eliminating infested trees. And initially, the USDA proceeded as they did in other communities with infestations. They were doing full host removal. But the Worcester community pushed back on this due to the high percentage of maples throughout our city. So the USDA amended their efforts here and removed only infested trees and the host trees in the immediately surrounding areas. So as far as the eradication program players go, we have the USDA, and they're responsible for managing the identification of infested trees and removal of these trees. Then we have APHIS, which is Animal, Plant, and Health Inspectional Services, responsible for a lot of the research on ALB, pest management options, behavior of the pest if no host tree exists, and things like that. We have the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. Besides being part of the replanting effort, they are also responsible for large-scale, they were responsible for large-scale replanting, and they are also part of the climbing and detection teams. And then in the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources, MDAR, they have the responsibility for education regarding Asian longhorn beetle and other forest pests.
So back to the discovery. In August 2008, it was a resident of Burncoat, the Burncoat neighborhood in Worcester, and she was bothered by an unknown insect that seemed to be dropping from the trees in her yard. Knowing that her grandchildren were visiting, she decided to research the insect online and see if it were dangerous or not. She photographed the pest and had identified it on a USDA site as the Asian longhorn beetle. And so she immediately contacted the USDA representative that was listed on the website, and the national website, and she sent along a photo. The next day, that USDA representative was in Worcester from Washington, D.C. And so there's a movie that is actually on the internet called Lurking in the Trees. The whole story is spelled out in that really wonderful documentary. And that they knew immediately, or at least the USDA knew, that it was going to be a giant problem in Worcester. And as it says on the screen, and I mentioned before, 30,000 trees were removed. 90% of Burncoat's canopy came down pretty much in that first winter. As of March 1st, 2019, this year, we have had 36,235 trees removed. In addition to that, we have had 1,656 full host acreage removals. That's not just in Worcester, that is in the whole quarantine zone. And those towns include Worcester, Holden, Boylston, West Boylston, Auburn, and Shrewsbury. And we'll show you a map that'll be coming up. So here's an example. People have seen these photos or similar photos of the complete devastation. The top photo here shows you how your street might have looked in Burncoat on the day that you went off to work. And then when you came home, this is exactly what you might have come home to. Street after street was complete devastation. You can see just a few yard trees that were not host trees were left for people to come home to. So motions ran high. As I said, there was a lot of pushback to the USDA. I was sitting in some of the meetings as an observer, watching the pushback that they got about just complete full host removal. People lost significant trees in their lives. They had trees that were planted for special occasions. The whole face of the neighborhood had changed. Suddenly they realized they were closer to the highway. This is the quote, "I never used to be able to see I-190 and all the stuff down there." Their energy usage went up, not just in the summertime, but also in the winter. And if you wanted to get more information about that, there is a UMass Amherst study that is also easy to find online that sort of went into that energy consumption. I mean, pretty much it went up about 100%.
So let's back up and give you a glimpse of Worcester. Now, it's a post-industrial city, town, and manufacturing used to make up most of its economy. You know, it's the second largest city actually in New England. We have a population of over 180,000. The surrounding towns, however, are very suburban and rural, and it borders, again, as we said before, the contiguous maple hardwood forest that runs up even into the Arctic Circle. Here's our quarantine zone. It's roughly 100 square miles. So that is the largest space of infestation in the US of ALB. So this map has not, the red line shows you the delineation. That hasn't expanded since 2009. It incorporates 6 towns, just parts of 2 of them, but it's still quite a large area. And you can see by the density of those dots, the surveyed trees, where a lot of the infestations were found. And that area with the high density of blue dots is the Burncoat and Greendale area. And again, here's a map of that forest. So you can see the yellow space represents maple forests, and Worcester, sits right here in Massachusetts, where it could go anywhere from here. Worcester is still a hub where a lot of rail yards run through. A lot of people come through for tourism just to see, these maple forests as they change color. So this beetle could easily hitchhike if wood were being moved around. And you can see also the other locations where infestations have been: New York, New Jersey. The first one ever was in the US was in Illinois and Chicago. More recently it was discovered in Ohio. It's also been present in Canada.
So why Worcester? Well, in 1953, this top photo shows that a powerful tornado had ripped through that neighborhood, which is on a hill, and basically went through Assumption College, which was located in this neighborhood at the time. They had about 60 people killed, and a substantial number of trees were destroyed. And as people know, because we also had a recent tornado in Springfield, it just devastates the culture, it devastates the neighborhood. So at the time, the people who were planning for trees in Worcester decided, let's just get this retreed as quickly as possible. Let's find a beautiful tree species. And they chose the Norway maple. We know now that it's, an invasive type of species, but it's beautiful. It does well in urban environments. It was a really great choice for what they were thinking. That said, they created a monoculture of trees. And when you have a monoculture, I think they knew back then, but maybe didn't think it through, especially with the global economy that we have now. You're just setting yourself up for trouble if you have anything like a pest or disease or anything like that. So in the left-hand corner shows that there's a lot of industry in Worcester, and we are importing things and we are exporting things. But when you import things and maybe wood pellets are unregulated and untreated, it's a way for pests to get into an environment. And this was all spelled out by this wonderful book by Evelyn Hurwitz called Trees at Risk. And this book is wonderful. It goes into the whole history of trees in Worcester, which it has a beautiful history of trees. But she also understood by the time she wrote this book that other Asian longhorn beetle infestations had happened in the United States. And she really understood that this could easily happen in Worcester. And in spite of that, and in spite of having people out looking at our trees, really this was not discovered, or at least it wasn't acknowledged, for about 15 years or so. So by the time we did understand that there was a big infestation, it had been here for quite a while.
So here's a list of host species of ALB at this point. This is the most up-to-date list of tree hosts that we know. Obviously, all kinds of maples, but it also has other hosts, including all birches, elms, the Ohio buckeye, and willows. And then, of course, there are some that are not necessarily preferred hosts, but occasional hosts, such as European mountain ash, all other kinds of ashes, London plane tree, mimosa, and poplar. So obviously, this really crippled our replanting efforts in some way, because there were so many things that we could not plant. Now, of course, we found plenty of other things to plant, but with some of these being such common and hardy trees to the urban environment, we really had to think creatively and think critically.
One of the things I would like to add is that there is a formula of replanting, and that is that they don't want to have a monoculture anymore. So they've been very good about replanting a variety of trees, a variety of different species, so that when another pest or another infestation or any sort of blight comes through, we're not wiping out all of our tree canopy.
And of course, as you likely all know, there are a whole host of benefits to having trees in our community, which is obviously why it can be so devastating, even beyond what anybody might recognize when any given tree might come down in a person's house. When you look at it on a massive scale, the condition of the air, the benefits that are being provided to our mental health, the stormwater that's running off, the habitat, all of these are being drastically impacted. And of course, we also know that in order to get these benefits, you need to have the trees where you actually live, and you need to have mature trees, trees that survive long enough to grow into large and beautiful trees. So, just having conservation land at the edge of town or a park somewhere else in the city doesn't necessarily help you in your neighborhood. And there needs to be a concerted effort to plant trees equitably and create green spaces equitably throughout towns and cities.
So we touched on these before, but in terms of reforestation, there were three major entities. Worcester Tree Initiative, and to date, we've planted well over 6,000 trees. How do we do that? So we are an agency of 2 people, and we have summer staff that we hire. We hire students and young people to help us maintain trees. But we have given and planted a lot of trees with a very small staff. So the way that we did that was a 3-pronged effort. One is we did tree giveaways, and this is a photo of a tree giveaway where we have potted trees that you can plant easily, you can transport easily, and we would have people come in and take a tree training, because we're very strict about people needing to learn how to properly plant a tree and then properly care for and mulch a tree. And we also always had handouts for people to take home with them. And finally, we actually always encourage people to call us or contact us if they had tree questions. So giveaways were a really big way that we got trees out into the community. We've sort of scaled back on that for different reasons, mostly because it's not such an emergency situation. We really prefer community plantings rather than just giving trees away. But at the time, it was really important for people to get trees quickly and to put them into their own yards and to get trained around that. So trainings are always a part of our mix, whatever we do. If we canvass people for watering, if we water trees, if we take care of trees, if we're working with community groups, we always properly train people how to take care of a tree, plant a tree, think about trees. And then we get into the schools, not just in Worcester, but in all the surrounding towns. But Worcester has roughly 50 schools, and we've been in virtually all of them at least once. We've been in many of them more than once. And we do the same thing over and over. We will plant trees if there's space. We will give the kids training as to how to properly plant a tree and how to properly take care of a tree. We go and we do tree identification trainings, and we've moved into a lot of tree care training. So how do you assess the health of a tree? How do you, prune a tree? How do you think about a tree in your urban environment? Because at this point, we have a lot of new trees in Worcester. We have to think about taking care of them. The DCR was a major player in this reforestation effort. They came in with a lot of power, a lot of manpower, a lot of tools, trucks, things that we just don't have. But they also did a great job of training people. So they did a lot of ALB replacement trees on private property also, not in a giveaway model, but in a model where they would knock on somebody's door, ask them if they wanted trees, and then they would plant the trees on the property, but always engage with the community residents. So they would also leave them information about how to properly plant a tree and how to properly care for a tree. And then the city of Worcester, we have a forestry department, and they probably planted more than 5,000 trees, but approximately 5,000 is what we have on record as a hard and fast record of how many trees they planted. And both the city of Worcester and Worcester Tree Initiative are still out there planting trees. We do partner together because they let us take care of these trees on some level. The DCR at this point has moved on from Worcester. They gave us a lot of trees. They've given us a lot of manpower. They've been very good to us. But at this point, their official replanting for the ALB has ended in Worcester. So these are other examples of our giveaways, maybe in the heyday of our organization, just hundreds and hundreds of trees, and it was a giant community effort. We had volunteers that would come and transport the trees, put them in people's cars, always tracked where the trees went to the best of our capability. So most of the trees, I would say about 95% of the trees, we know where they went or where people told us they were going to go. Plantings, like I said, we really are more interested in community plantings now. And as Derek sort of alluded to before, we're very much interested in environmental justice because that is something that's critical right now in our city, very industrial city. And so it's a lot easier for us to give trees away or plant trees in the suburban towns around Worcester and even parts of Worcester. But we're really trying hard to focus on the places that are not so easy to plant a street tree, and how do you get trees into that community. We also water these trees. Our second summer that we started, it dawned on us that a lot of these trees that were being planted in public situations were not being cared for or watered. So we created what's called the Young Adult Forestry Program. We do partner with the city on that. They do help us financially with that program. And it's a way to get kids employed for the summer, and also Massport is a big supporter of that as well. So they get paid for the summer, they learn about trees, and they interact with these trees every day through the summer. We've also moved on to have a structural pruning program. And again, Derek and I run a training classes up at Tower Hill Botanic Garden called Master's Tree Steward classes. Teach people about the basics of trees, the basics of structural pruning trees. And we've gotten permission from the city to go out, and any of the trees that are younger that we can stand on the ground and prune, they let us prune those trees. And everything we do is we have data tracking. So we know every tree that we've pruned, we know what we've done to that tree. We take the city data and we understand when these trees were planted, and we go out and we structurally prune them. And then finally, as we get more into environmental justice and, you know, finding harder places to plant trees, we do a lot of ongoing research projects. And we are fortunate enough to have many colleges in Worcester. And right now, Clark University has been the college that gives us a lot of students who are equipped to do these research projects. And what we're doing is trying to paint a picture, neighborhood by neighborhood, of where trees exist, where they might be able to exist, and overall sort of tree canopy. A lot of our data tracking, we use the iTree system, so we can generate really good reports regarding what tree canopy exists and what tree canopy is lacking in different neighborhoods.
So here's a slide showing some community tree planting and tree care. You know, we partner with everyone and anyone from corporations and church groups to schools and daycares and, of course, homeowners. Community plantings are our favorite things to do, as long as we know that the trees will be cared for once we're gone. And frankly, when you're planting them with the person who lives right next to it, you can be pretty sure of that. We do offer some follow-up care. You know, we offer trainings. We've offered fruit tree pruning trainings and flowering trees and shrub pruning trainings. And then we often revisit sites where we have planted. The next slide shows you, another example of a community planting. This one we did with TD Tree Days or TD Green Streets, where the bank actually, provided a grant money to do a planting of fruit trees next to this community garden in a park. And then this next slide shows another image from that same planting. And then this one was one we did with a local CSA, where we provided them with some fruit trees to add to their mix.
So I do want to make sure that we mention the City of Worcester Forestry Department. As I mentioned before, about 5,000 street trees or public trees have been planted by them since 2009. And we can't do anything unless they're willing to partner with us and also give us permission to, touch the trees that are public street trees. So we have been very grateful for their support throughout the years, and our partnership does seem to be growing. Anytime we get a grant that has to be funneled through the city, they're very good about approving the grant and then giving us the funds once we've completed the project.
And then here we have some images of the DCR replanting crews. So they came into the replanting effort about 2 years in, but they came in with a lot of staff and equipment, and they kept very careful records and were extremely valuable to the replanting effort, obviously, with almost 20,000 trees planted. The USDA and DCR allow WTI also to have an office and storage space in their office complex. And this has allowed us to easily communicate and partner with them.
So here's an example of what I was talking about, a tree planting demonstration, which is the tree training portion of our giveaway. And Derek is just showing people how to plant a potted tree. And like I said, people cannot walk away with a tree unless they've sort of suffered through one of these. But inevitably, people tell us that they've learned something that they didn't know. Most of you, if you're tree people, know that one of the biggest problems is people plant way too deep in a hole. So that's one of the most enlightening parts of that training. And then we love teaching students. So this happens to be me. There's a big community planting. There happen to be a lot of students. And it's amazing what kids actually know about trees. But we love taking the time to not just do tree planting classes with kids, but like I said, tree care classes. I also have a program that we started where we do maple sugaring in one of the local parks in the Maine South. And it's unbelievable to me how kids in 6th grade might not even know that trees can produce something like maple syrup. Basically, our hope with all of this training is to inspire youth to think about their immediate environment, even if they are in a dense urban setting, and to understand that green space is green space, even if it's a street tree and, you know, on a very paved roadway, that's your environment, and to just think about it and take care of it. These are some of our school plantings. Like I said, there's at least 50 schools in Worcester. We've conducted well over 90 school plantings since 2010 in the suburbs, in Worcester. And again, some schools allow for us to come over and over again. And as I've said a lot now, every planting includes a review of the benefits of trees in our urban environment, and also teaches people how to properly plant and take care of a new tree. This is, we captured some pictures of the first giveaway that Worcester Tree Initiative had. It was in April 2009. I actually was not with the agency at that point. The way that it is described to me is, if anybody knows of Filene's Basement, when they used to give away the bridal gowns for cheap, it was called the Running of the Brides. It was like that. As we sort of built up the story before, people were very emotional about losing their trees. A lot of the Burncoat neighborhood had their trees cut just in January. Finally, spring comes, and people just really wanted trees. It was very emotional for them. And so it was kind of chaotic, but it got the job done. And a lot of these trees, now that we structurally prune, one of the most fun parts of that particular program is people will come out of their homes when they see us on a Saturday morning and give us a story of how they got their tree. And I can tell you that a lot of the trees from this particular giveaway wound up in Burncoat.
So here's a slide just to show you some of the data that we're collecting anytime we go out and do those structural tree prunings, and what we plug into iTree and into our own data sheet. So, you know, we're looking, of course, for species. LU and ST are regarding, you know, what kind of location this is planted in, land use, site type. Then, of course, the size, any sort of maintenance, whether the maintenance is required. If it's a larger tree, we still track that information, and we can make those recommendations to the forestry department. We want to know if there's any sidewalk heave, if there's a wire conflict, what the condition of the trunk and what the condition of the canopy is. And then, of course, just the location, the address, so that we can figure out, you know, when we're going to log this in, or if we're coming back to the tree, how things were in the past.
And then all of this data goes into iTree. And as I mentioned before, we can generate some really good reports about the trees in Worcester. Stewards in the Street, this is the structural tree pruning program that I mentioned. One of the things that I haven't spelled out is the fact that Worcester Tree started as our own small agency. We'd always had fiscal agents because we weren't intended to be a permanent solution. We were intended to be strictly a response replanting effort. But as time went on and people understood that we still needed an agency like ours in our community to engage with the community, they decided to make us a permanent organization, and the best way and easiest way to do that was to try to find a larger organization to take us on. And happily, Tower Hill Botanic Garden, which is Worcester County Horticultural Society, they had always been one of our fiscal agents, and they really saw the value of our program to also improve their mission up here at Tower Hill and Boylston. And so they look to us to be the community outreach arm of Tower Hill. It's been a process of the last 3 years, and April 1st of this year, we are officially a program of Tower Hill. And it's just been wonderful. So one illustration of that is Jarek and I run classes up here. They're very well attended. One of them is a Master Tree Stewards program where we charge just pretty much a nominal fee for 5 classes, 5 long classes in the evenings. And we give all kinds of great information, have all kinds of great speakers come and help us. And then we ask people who take these classes to give us 20 hours of volunteer work in exchange for this great training and, you know, become part of that community. And most of the 20 hours come to us in terms of stewards in the street. So we are out through mid-November through mid-April, structurally pruning street trees. As I said before, we have to stay on the ground. We can't use ladders or bucket trucks or anything like that. And we are faithful every other weekend, Friday, Saturday, we are out with our community. And just have tripled the amount of volunteers that come out with us regularly. And what happens is you form a community, and it's a really great team of people who are interested in trees in general and street trees in Worcester. We've expanded this to fruit tree pruning. We've done several urban orchards in downtown Worcester. We found out that people really need the training year after year of what do I do with these trees? You know, how do I get them to produce fruit? How do I make them structurally sound? So we have a series of fruit tree pruning workshops. This is an example right here of these slides, are fruit tree pruning in Worcester. I mean, at Tower Hill Botanic Garden in Boylston.
So another area where we've exercised a lot of effort and we've brought our stewards in is into Dodge Park. This is a particular park in Worcester. There are over 60 parks in Worcester, and we have planted in several of them. But this one was deeply affected by Asian longhorn beetle. And so, you know, we bring all sorts of people to help to manage the replanting effort in there. As you might be able to tell from some of these pictures, there has been a lot of regeneration. So, you know, we're trying to help to protect the investment that was made into the park because it was ultimately made into an arboretum to show what species are resistant to Asian longhorn beetle. This is about a 13-acre park, and roughly about 8 acres of the park had been completely, basically clear-cut because they were completely full of host species. So more than 500 plants went into the space, and so now we spend a lot of effort trying to make sure that those are maintained. We bring our YAF program into there, which is our Young Adult Foresters program, which I'm going to talk about next. Young Adult Foresters, as Ruth had mentioned, was started as a watering program because we wanted to make sure that that the city trees were being cared for and watered. So we would rent a truck initially. Now we finally are at a point where we will have our own truck. We also purchased a water tank, a pump system, and we have some hoses, and we hire students to work for 7 to 10 weeks throughout the summer watering trees along the streets. But that program's really expanded. They also now get into Dodge Park and some of the other parks and just tend to some of the other plantings where we've made investments, and there's not necessarily one person who's going to be taking care of those or who can get to them regularly. So we'll go out and make sure that they are being cared for as well.
And I just want to say the Young Adult Forestry program has really also gotten a lot of teeth because kids now come to us we do advertise the jobs, but we let students come back each summer. So if they were with us last year, they get first dibs on the jobs for next summer. And it is interesting to me how many of these students come back And we've had, now that we've been doing this program since 2011, we've been around enough to have students come back and say, you know what, that's what I wound up studying in college, or you know what, I did more training on a national scale or even an international scale. So that, you know, besides the fact that trees are actually getting cared for, it really is exciting for me to see that it sparks interest with these kids in the future. So I talked about this a little bit. We've increased our capacity being part of Tower Hill. They just have a much larger reach, not just in our area, but throughout the state. They are a wonderful botanic garden. If you haven't visited them, I encourage you to do so. And on the right shows an example of stewards in the street, like I talked about before. But on the left is a traffic island that we adopted from the city of Worcester. And Tower Hill had a horticulture intern up here last summer, and I asked her if she would help me design plants around these trees that had been planted in this very large traffic island. And so she came up with the design, the horticulture director approved the design, and then this past fall, we had extra funding to use for the plantings. But this is our director, or the CEO of Tower Hill, Grace Elton, in the left here, the horticulture director, some horticulture staff, Derek and myself, Worcester Tree Initiative volunteers, and also volunteers from Tower Hill Botanic Garden. For me, it's just a really wonderful example of how Tower Hill is getting into the community of Worcester, and how Worcester is benefiting not just from Worcester Tree Initiative, but also from Tower Hill Botanic Garden. Some of the other fun things that we've been able to branch into is improving the state of the trees in sort of subtle ways. On the left here are chestnut trees, and we have been working with the American Chestnut Foundation. And these are seeds that had been grown on trees that we planted 5 years ago in Green Hill Park in Worcester. And we fertilize them, and they produce nuts. And so the American Chestnut Foundation let us know that these are blight-resistant chestnut trees. They are growing seedlings from the seeds, and the hope is to get them to a good size, and then we can go back and plant them in Green Hill Park and throughout Worcester as trees produce more. And the chestnut tree was a very large part of the canopy back in the day in Worcester and in Green Hill Park in particular. And we feel really excited that, you know, we can help facilitate the comeback of a tree like that. The photo on the right here shows Derek conducting a class in an historic location of Hadwin Arboretum, which is a Clark University property here in Worcester. And it was a property with a lot of beautiful, unique trees to the area that were planted by by Obadiah Hadwin. And he bequeathed the property, it's about 27 acres, to Clark University. And we've gone in there and done a couple of really great trainings, and we've been working with a professor over there at Clark University to improve this beautiful treasure in Worcester. So those are extra things that we do. We're primarily about planting and taking care of trees, but I love the fact that we also have the time to help with these kind of projects in and around Worcester.
All right, and wrapping up, I just want to talk a little bit about our stance on environmental justice and what we're doing to try to promote that and why it's so important. So, you know, a lot of the areas that we have in Worcester are densely developed, and you know, we're seeing a lot of new development where trees might be getting removed and buildings being erected, and you know, so obviously we're just kind of losing some ground. So we see it as a really big and important part of our mission to find places to plant trees and advocate for people to create spaces for trees even as they develop new buildings. So we planted at a local health center. This was a memorial tree, a beech tree that was planted for one of their former chair people who had passed away. This is in a very dense neighborhood. This hospital in particular serves a lot of low-income families, minority families. The Jakes Ave Urban Orchard, this was planted in a small 2-parcel lot that was empty. And so we worked together with several local community groups to help plant about 20 trees. There are also now raised bed gardens, and the whole space is cared for by Bhutanese refugees who we were connected to through Lutheran Social Services, now a Century of Care Alliance. And then University Park, this is a park that is right in the Maine South, which is one of the lower income neighborhoods, more highly developed neighborhoods in Worcester. And so we just decided, we're going to plant some trees in this park because there are a lot of spaces where trees had been removed in the past 10 years, but nothing had been replanted. So we worked with some of the local university students who you see in the picture there to actually plant within the park, which they walk through all the time and enjoy. And they have friends who live in the area who are going to help us keep an eye on the trees.
So that is what we have. I just wanted to say thank you for letting us present. This mulch job was done by one of our volunteers. Just sort of illustrates for us how much we really do love trees. So thank you very much for letting us present.
Well, this has been awesome. I think this is a fantastic example of what can be done, and I'm really glad we have this presentation recorded, because really this is a great example for other communities maybe wanting to make this type of effort. And wow, it's pretty good thing to watch, especially now, in these days. I do have a question for you from one of our participants. And this was early on in the presentation. She asks, are these all urban trees, and in parentheses, streets, sidewalks, or manicured parks? Are some of them in more natural areas?
So yes, we very rarely, as Worcester Tree Initiative, plant City of Worcester street trees, although we have been allowed to do that on occasion. And the reason is, usually a street tree needs to be about 2.5 inches in caliper, and usually the trees that we get that are in buckets are usually about 1 inch to 1.5 inches in caliper. And the reason is, I don't have equipment to take a large ball and burlap tree that's at 2.5 inch caliper and put it in the ground. So the trees that we're caring for are all City of Worcester street trees, but the trees that we give away or plant are usually in people's yards or in another sort of public space that is cared for by community members. So for instance, Dodge Park, we planted a ton of trees in Dodge Park, but we're in there taking care of them. Or the community gardens that you saw. Those are technically public spaces, but they're watched over by the community. And then the place where we have planted street trees is like on a very dead-end road in Worcester, where the residents were right there taking care of these trees. When we plant in the suburban towns, it's not as clear cut what's a city tree versus what's a town tree. So all those trees are essentially on private property or in a park setting. I hope that answers that.
Yeah, and just to add to that, so with the exception of Dodge Park, where there was a lot of natural regeneration, we're not typically going into a woodland setting where there was like full host removal on several acres and planting in those spaces. It was just determined that, especially based on the work that we've been doing in Dodge Park to try to clean up around it and protect the investment, that doing it on such a massive scale in woodland areas just would be a little bit too intensive for us, especially for our agency, and also that a lot of the trees were going to grow back on their own anyway, though it may not be the same species composition.
So the acreage that I had identified as being cut, a lot of that, it's been determined by not us, but by people that have higher authority than we do, to just allow natural succession, natural regeneration to take over.
All right, thank you. Another question, what kinds of replacement trees did you use to replant, and what kinds of criteria did you use to choose them?
So among the species that we selected, we use a host of oak varieties. We've been using tulip tree or yellow poplar. We use honey locust, sweet gums, and then we also use a variety of smaller trees like crab apples, cherries, serviceberry, dogwood. And then for yard plantings, we can, evergreens are all fair game, so we use a whole host of evergreens as well if people are interested in them. The criteria that we used were basically just couldn't be host, and it also had to be locally available. And we didn't necessarily select for native versus non-native, which I know a lot of people say you should only plant native trees, or that's the mentality some people have. We, especially for urban settings, didn't necessarily feel we had that luxury. When it comes to a park setting, we might try to favor native over non-native, and certainly whenever we could sell somebody on a native tree, we would, but we also didn't want to go over that limit of maybe 10% of any given species or less, hopefully, to make sure that we were planting more diversely.
And then finally, just to add on that, we worked off of lists that were recommended to us by the USDA and the DCR foresters. So this isn't Worcester Tree Initiative deciding on what's planted, or even the city of Worcester deciding on what's planted. But through research on the USDA, the federal government level, those are the types of trees that we're allowed to plant in this quarantine zone.
Okay, that sounds good. That is it for the questions that I have right now. I just want to remind our participants that in the email that you will be receiving tomorrow, my email address is there. If you wanted more information, hold on here. Oh, we have another question. I'm sorry. Okay. How well have the trees done survival/overall health, and what are the barriers to keeping them healthy?
Well, that's a really good question. I would say what we have found, and there are studies that Clark University has done, and they've published them, that what we find is trees that are well stewarded really survive very well. And in general, people's trees in their yards do better than street trees, and that, to me, is for obvious reasons. But to spell it out, the things that make it hard for a tree, first of all, is getting enough water. So in this 10-year period, we have had some drought conditions. And a lot of times it's not the first year or the second year after the trees are planted, but maybe the third or fourth year when we stop watering the trees, or people don't really understand that if they're stressed, you should water them. So those are the things that get in the way of trees. And then City of Worcester has the same problems everybody does with street trees. They get plowed, they get broken, they get cut. It's just, street trees are really abused depending on where they're planted. And then the other thing is, to Derek's point, we can only plant so many native species because of, maples are really great street tree. They're a really great tree to plant in our community. We can't do that. So some of these trees we find do get susceptible to, extreme weather conditions. So maybe extreme cold or a frost heave or that kind of thing. So those are barriers to survival of all trees, but street trees in particular.
Yeah, I would note that, anything that's been borderline. I remember one year in particular, we had a pretty harsh winter, and the sweet gums, which are typically not found this far north, had a really tough year. We experienced a lot of dieback on sweet gums that year because of the fringe of the hardiness zone factor. Other than that, I don't think we've had any abnormal other pest problems that we've experienced with the trees. It's mostly just been environmental and human factors.
And so Clark University, like I said, they publish things. They go back and interview people who have received yard trees from both the DCR and Worcester Tree Initiative. Worcester Tree Initiative has gone back several points in the last 10 years to check on trees and that are in people's yards. And then, like I said, we are out there health assessing the trees that are on the street. And I mean, we have a pretty high percentage rate. I mean, it definitely is within the 80% range. Those numbers are clear spelled out. If you look up Clark University, they have some studies on that.
All right. I think that's it as far as questions. I'm still on, so one might pop up here in a minute. But anyway, I just wanted to say, if you have more questions for Ruth and Derek, let me know when you receive that email, and I will make sure to forward those questions to them for you to get answered. But if that's it, I wanted to say thank you so much, Ruth and Derek, for providing this information and putting this together. It's been very enlightening, and like I say, this is a great example of what people can do. And as you know, there's more as we face more and more different threats to our trees and that kind of thing. So, with that, I